So hello there guys and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. I hope that you guys are well. I hope that you're doing safe and everything is good wherever you are listening or watching this around the world. I hope that you also had a great Easter break. Of course, we're recording this the week before the Easter bank holiday, so some of the stuff that we might say maybe not as relevant, or there might be some updates, but I'm sure it's going to be a great discussion nonetheless. And for this episode, I wanted to talk about a story that some of you may have kept your eye on, but I think it's one that's going to progress and get more interesting as the season goes on, and obviously probably hidden under the realms of everything else going on in F1 making the headlines, and that is the developing rivalry between Sir Lewis Hamilton and George Russell, and of course what that means for the Mercedes team and what it means for both drivers going forward. Introducing my guest onto this show, we have F1 journalist Ben Hunt. And Ben, you wrote a fantastic article sort of highlighting this developing story right now. So I'm really looking forward to talking with you. And, you know, first things first, of course, we've got to check in. How are things with you, of course?
Yeah, all good, thank you. Yeah, been a busy couple of weeks, hasn't it? It's been a strange start to the season, almost stop-start with the gaps in between. And, of course, we've now got this gap in between Australia and Azerbaijan, and it feels like forever, but it is very lopsided. I always keep mentioning this to people. You know, I'm like a broken record, but look at the end of the season. We've got 5 races in 6 weeks, and that's properly scary. So I'm enjoying the downtime. I'm enjoying being at home. But yeah, it's got off to a strange start, hasn't it? We're talking about other things around the subject. We haven't had a great race yet, so let's get stuck into the politics.
Exactly. I mean, we had a lot of crazy action happen towards the end of the Australian Grand Prix with all the red flags and the safety cars and this new precedent, I suppose, that F1 and the FIA are trying to set in terms of how to finish races that end in this certain manner. I get they're trying something. I was a little bit confused about how it all went down. I'm sure a lot of teams and fans were too. I think something needs to be communicated going forward. But overall, I can't complain at the idea of them wanting to finish a race without having to resort to using the safety car. Eventually that's what happened, but of course, you know, that's another discussion for another day, and I'm sure you have plenty to say on that. Of course, Ben, I think first thing we have to start, since you last joined us on the show, you've started your own F1 podcast with your colleague Beck Clancy. Unless I'm mistaken, Inside the Piranha Club, it's called.
Yes,
very interesting name. Can you tell us a little bit about that for?
It's the name comes from do you remember Flavio Briatore? And he mentioned to another team boss at a meeting, and it was sort of welcome to the Piranha Club. That's what F1 is like.
Yes.
And so, you know, the cutthroat business of Formula One. And the idea is that myself and Beck are able to provide insight, you know, behind the scenes, if you like. You know, we're actually at the races, and we just thought it was a good idea just to get a podcast off the ground. So we've enjoyed doing it. It's been very well received. And if anyone wants to check it out, you know, go and do it and let me know what you think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've got to ask, how does it feel to be on the other side of the podcast and booth, being the person asking the questions? I mean, it's more cut and dry with your day job, I suppose. But
yeah, that's right. It's kind of more suited to what we do on a day-to-day basis. The difference being is that we don't have any bosses or any word targets, or, you know, no constraints, shall we say. So we're able to call it how we see it. We're able to inject more of our own thoughts and opinions, and obviously it'd be a little bit maybe more controversial than perhaps we would in print. So yeah, it's super fun. I'm really enjoying it.
Well, I've listened to your first couple of episodes. I've really enjoyed it, and I suppose all I can really say to those of loads of my followers that want to check out your content is, if you want to get the insight of a couple of top-level F1 journalists without any editorial guidelines, so, you know, can cut through all the fat and just get straight to the content, definitely check out the Inside the Piranha Club podcast with Beck Clancy and, of course, Ben Hunt. Ben, of course, I've got to ask, where can our followers find your podcast if they are unsure yet?
It's everywhere, wherever people get their podcasts from. You know, we're there. If you search for us, you'll find us. But yeah, please do. Please check it out. If you can't find it there, then check across we've got an Instagram account, we've got a TikTok account. but also we're plugging it on our own Twitters as well. So you should be able to find it.
Yeah, brilliant stuff. And of course, we'll plug that in the show notes and in the description as well. For those of you watching this on YouTube or listening on your favorite pod platform, don't forget, of course, to subscribe to this channel and also like the video, and of course, support us on your favorite pod platform as well. As we always appreciate every single one of you getting in touch and supporting us. Much, much appreciated. Now, of course, Ben, we've got to break down and discuss the talking point for this particular episode, and that is the battle and the developing situation between George Russell and Sir Lewis Hamilton, arguably F1's strongest driver pairing. And up to a point last season, a lot of us would have pretty much said that the relationship between the two wasn't necessarily strained. Everything seemed to be okay, despite the difficult season that Mercedes were having. But over the course of last season, there were one or two signs that this ongoing rivalry might develop, and that perhaps the balance of power at Mercedes may shift away from Sir Lewis Hamilton and perhaps closer to George Russell over the course of the next few years, providing, of course, that George Russell keeps up his level of performance. Now, before we get into what's happening in 2023, let's talk about George Russell's performance in 2022. Got his maiden pole in Hungary, maiden race win in Brazil, which included the sprint race as well. Finished P4 in the standings, 35 points ahead of Sir Lewis Hamilton, although there were plenty of caveats to that. And no surprise to many, the quali gap in terms of time difference was the smallest between the two compared to any other team on the grid, with, of course, Sir Lewis just edging, I think, a few hundredths ahead of George. Overall, that paints a picture to a very impressive debut season with Mercedes for George Russell.
Yeah.
In your opinion, how did you think George Russell fared compared to his teammate last season?
Yeah, 100%. I think there was a number of factors that contributed to George being a success. I think, first off, we obviously have to admit that he's a talent. You know, he's definitely got the ability, he's got the skill. You know, he's won so much before. We know that he's good. The time at Williams obviously allowed him to sort of go under the radar, if you like, and sort of start learning about F1, what it was required to not only drive for an F1 team, but also lead that team as well. And I don't think that is a disrespect to Nicholas Latifi, but we definitely saw George drive that Williams team forward. You know, he wasn't afraid to voice his opinions and help with the direction of the car. And I think that's put him in good stead for a future role as Mercedes number one, if you like. I think that in terms of George's character, there was no doubt about that. He had the, confidence. You know, he obviously put his name forward to become director of the GPDA, the Grand Prix Drivers Association, which kind of brings all the drivers together and bodes them together in terms of the decision making and progress. And that's quite a big, responsible job. But also it shows you his level of confidence. And if you didn't know George was a confident guy, those sort of things, that sort of action would obviously highlight just how he felt that he could represent the drivers as a body, despite only being F1 for a relatively short time. Majority, I would assume, have got to F1 and thought, that's not really my responsibility. That's someone for the older driver. That's the sort of Lewis role or Fernando. That's where they should be. But no, he's taken that on. So it shows you that he has got that inner self-confidence within him, which is great. I think that the fact that he was part of the Mercedes Young Driver Program, Junior Program, whichever you want to call it, that obviously allowed him to get up to speed quickly with the team. So while he was making his debut for Mercedes, if you excuse the Sakir Grand Prix, when it was Sakir, wasn't it? Was it?
Yeah, it was, because he stepped in
Sakir,
for Lewis
rather than Bahrain.
Yeah.
So yes, so when he filled in for that one race, but he was well up to speed. You know, he knew all the engineers, he knew what he was dealing with. He'd been driving the car on the simulator. So it wasn't quite the alien experience that perhaps we see some other drivers go through. You know, when you're propelled to the big teams, it can be a little bit like rabbit in the headlights, whereas obviously George was well versed. It wasn't as alien to him. The other factor, of course, we need to remember is last year that car was an absolute dog. And so we all knew that from an early point. The sun is fantastic, isn't it? Look at this going on.
Well, I mean, we're getting all the different levels of brightness. If you're watching this on YouTube, it looks like Ben's going through some sort of divine experience at the moment whilst he's talking about George Russell.
I might have to pull that curtain in a minute. But where was I? Oh, yeah, of course, the car was a dog. So it covered a lot of the issues, they had the teething problems as teammates, and we just saw George delivering, and we were like, wow, okay, this is pretty good. He gets the win, in the pole, and you mentioned the sprint race as well. So everything was all going along quite swimmingly, but we was all distracted with the porpoising and everything else, and we just thought that Lewis played this. I put it in my column. It was like a sacrificial lamb sort of role where he was trying all these different setup types, whereas George was benefiting from that and able to reap the rewards. But comes into 2023 and it's slightly different, isn't it? He's had that year under his belt. He's got that win under his belt, and maybe it wasn't that Lewis was playing that sacrificial role altogether, in the fact that George is probably potentially outscoring him. It's now 3-0 in qualifying if we're looking at, pace, after the first three races this year. So quite interesting. And I think that the dynamic between the two of them is changing. I think Lewis is aware, that George is the next bright thing coming through the door. And when you're a seasoned pro, and you've got to be looking over your shoulder at what's coming. George has got a long-term deal. Lewis has only got end of the year,
end of the season, yeah.
So I think it's only inevitable that there will be some change in that relationship where George has become more confident. He knows he's the future of the team, the team. And Lewis is, for the first time in his career, the older statesman and the guy that's kind of under pressure, under threat, because we don't know if he's going to be kept on. We don't know if they're going to agree. They keep saying they are, but until that deal's done, we just don't know, do we? So it's an unusual position for Lewis to be in. The fact that he's got someone alongside him who is taking the fight to him. He's usually the other way around. Lewis obviously had Fernando. Then when he went to Mercedes, he took it to Rosberg. Bottas came to Mercedes, never really took the fight to Lewis. But now we're seeing George take the fight to Lewis, and it's interesting to see how that relationship and how Lewis responds. So, yeah, it's great. I mean, it's good for Formula One. It's just what we need. Some sort of rivalry between those two drivers, because it gives us something else to dig into and to look at, because out in front, Max is winning, isn't he? So, and looking like he's going to be 3-time world champion at the end of this year.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't bet against that right now, especially after the performance in Australia. It looked like even when he made a few mistakes, the guy was still in a league of his own. But that's just...
I mean, it was interesting, wasn't it? When he got past Lewis, I think he made... Was it 2 seconds on half a lap? Something ridiculous, like we've never seen before.
Although, I mean, to be fair, I was watching... I think it was on F1 Multiview. I was sort of watching the Delta on that. And I think whilst 2 seconds is incredibly impressive, there were a lot of caveats at play. I mean... Lewis obviously was talking on the radio and they told him to let Max go. There's no point racing because he's in a different league right now. Max obviously put out fastest lap. I think Lewis was 1.3 seconds slower than Fernando on that very lap. And when Lewis was overtaken, he wasn't compromised in terms of his corner entry. So he'd obviously turned the battery down, saved it, because he knew he'd have Alonso to deal with. So, when you sort of work it all out, it was still around about 7-8 tenths, I think, in Max's favour. But even then, that's still massively impressive. And obviously that Red Bull DRS is in a different league right now to what everyone else is. But that's another discussion for another day. Talking about George Russell, based on what you've said there, Ben, there's a lot to unpick from all of that. And I think one thing that people probably may not be aware of and perhaps need to get on board with is the fact that George Russell is not exactly your average rookie in a team like Mercedes. As you said, he's been with the team since his junior days. He's very well versed in a lot of testing runs with Mercedes. He did so many over the last few years, even when he was at Williams. He had that outing in Sakir in 2020, which was massively impressive, and he should have won on that day if it weren't for safety car issues and pit stop errors from Mercedes, uncharacteristic of them. He would have won on that day. And when he joined the Mercedes team last season, having the maturity and the wisdom beyond his years that we often associate with George Russell, having that extra mental capacity to do certain things that your average driver wouldn't be able to do, with the pace to boot, mind you, in that regard. And on top of all of that, it was a year that, because Mercedes were having their struggles, and as you mentioned, Sir Lewis being the sacrificial lamb or the guinea pig in some people's eyes, he had to do a lot of testing with the porpoising issues up to a point where Mercedes could develop the car where Lewis was finally able to compete for race wins and put together the performances we normally associate with him. All the while, George Russell was consistently banging in P5s, P4s, the odd podium here or there, pole position in Hungary, the win in Brazil. He was doing that and building an increased or more improved rapport with a team that he was gaining confidence with. If you called this his apprentice year, I don't think it could have gone much any better. And then you fast forward to 2023, it feels right now, after that learning process he's gone through, he's found confidence in where he needs to set this team. Now it seems that George Russell is starting to set boundaries. He's starting to push those with the team. He seems to know, after he's established himself there, what he needs to do to try and get the most from this team right now. And it's showing early this season.
Yeah, exactly that. He's not afraid to speak his mind, and that's actually what Mercedes want, isn't it? From a driver, that's what they need from a guy who's going to be, let's just say it. He will be leading that team when Lewis eventually stops. George will still be there. So that's exactly what they need. It's just watching that relationship play out, and obviously they've still got to deliver for the team. At the moment, it's fairly harmonious, but there is a change in language, I think, with George, and also he's not afraid now to answer back, whereas before he may have felt a little bit, in Lewis's shadow. I think he now sees himself as an equal. They're totally level playing field. He beat him last year in terms of race wins, and you mentioned obviously in the championship, and he's come into this year thinking, actually, maybe I can beat him again.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's a good place to start with where cracks might be forming, because people that obviously listening to this show may not have paid attention so far this season to what's been going on. I mean, first few races, George Russell has outqualified Lewis in all 3 races. Granted, Lewis is 20 points ahead of Russell in the championship, but I think we can put a lot of that down to George's unforeseen retirement in Australia, where George Russell himself claimed that he was on the right strategy to challenge for the race win. Realistically, I don't think that was possible because of how quick Max was, but I can understand that given how Sainz was able to get up there despite being on the same strategy as Russell, you'd have thought Russell could have at least got a P2, which is where Lewis ultimately finished. So you can understand the logic in that. But in particular, you mentioned the language that's changed between not just George Russell, but Sir Lewis Hamilton as well, some of the things that he said, which I'm sure we'll get onto in a moment. But what particular things has George Russell been saying, for the benefit of those that haven't paid attention to this, that suggest to you that there are starting to be some cracks forming and that George Russell is now starting to assert himself in a position where he wants that supremacy, if you like, in the team?
Yeah, I mean, the one for me was that got me thinking, first off, was when Lewis had hinted that George may have got lucky with setup in a race, and I think that Lewis said it was something like 50-50, you either go one way or another. And then George was asked about that, and rather than just saying yes or party line, it was no, absolutely wrong. I didn't get lucky. I went in a particular area because I thought that this was going to work, and Lewis went in another area which I didn't think was going to work. So that's kind of him being ballsy, if you like, standing up and saying, I made the right decision and he got it wrong, which I thought, okay, that's kind of brave of you. And then during the race in Australia, he had an instruction over the radio, and we heard the second part, which was, you're telling me to manage, look after the tyres, but I'm being attacked by my teammate. And I thought the very nature of him being attacked by Lewis was interesting, not in the sense that Lewis was the aggressor, but the fact that George felt aggrieved so much that he wanted to use those words to the team to tell them to, tell Lewis to back off. So I thought that was just telling. The fact is that he's using language which is kind of not aggressive, but certainly firm, and he's leaving his team in no doubt as to what position he sees himself, which is obviously as the lead driver.
Yeah, and he wasn't exactly talking from the perspective of let's do what's best for the team here, let's not try and get caught into any silly politics or who has control over what and such and such. He's very much, as you rightly put, invested in the idea that, look, I think to expand on the comments that Lewis had said about the setup, and George was saying that there's no luck in it at all. He mentioned specifically that it was down to the preparation.
Yeah, that's
for
right.
the event, and I think that's quite telling, because in the past, Sir Lewis Hamilton has been very well known as someone that does not like to do the prep. He doesn't like to do many sim work. He did a lot of it last year to help with those issues, and that was understandable. And it did bear some fruit in terms of performance. But historically, he's never been one to want to do much testing. He's naturally gifted. He's
Yeah,
wanted to do that.
that's
So,
true. That is true, but I'm not too sure this year just how much Lewis has done going into races. I know
mm,
he's doing more this year. He's definitely doing more sim work. So, um, I the reason I didn't necessarily pick up on that point, um, but you are right to make that point. The fact that Lewis used to just turn up and get in the car. I mean, I remember Singapore when he went to like he was flying all over the place. He went to about 25 different countries. There was Fashion Week in New York, and then flew back to then turned up in Singapore, and everyone's like, "There's no way that he's going to be able to drive the car." And then obviously put in one of the best laps of all time during qualifying, for the Singapore Grand Prix, and we were like, "Wow, that's unbelievable." But I guess what I'm trying to say in a long-winded way is that I understand where George is coming from, but I just don't necessarily know if I believe that, because I do believe that Lewis is working probably harder than he ever has done before in terms of his pre-race preparation.
yeah, I can agree with that. I mean, the logic for my sort of rationale on this is that, in addition to this, Lewis is one of those drivers that has this amazing ability to never really get on top of the car the first lap he goes out on the pits on track, particularly in qualifying.
Yeah.
And I think this is a good barometer to measure the two, where George Russell is incredibly good at getting that fast lap straight away. First out the box, doesn't have to worry about calibrating himself or getting used to it. He's quick straight away. Lewis has never really been that way, but amazingly, and I think he proved this at Melbourne as well, is that he never really looked on the pace for most of qualifying. Then when Q3 comes around, when it matters most, bam, he puts it on the front row. Of course, George did pip him just about, but Lewis is so good at doing that when it matters most. And I think sometimes you have to give him credit in the fact that, if he's so good at finding the pace when he needs to, does he really need to do the prep work? Even though he has been working very hard, you can understand the argument as to, well, George may think he's working harder than Lewis, but that may not necessarily be the case, or Lewis may not have to work as hard as George, for example.
Yes, possibly. Lewis is obviously a freakish talent, isn't he? And that ability just to turn it up in Q3 when he needs to is enviable.
It's very Senna-esque, isn't it?
Yeah, but probably over the last couple of years, I'm talking about before Max winning in 21, but Lewis has probably not needed to have dug so deep because he's always had the better of his teammate. He'd always be comfortably better than Valtteri. But as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, he's in an unfamiliar territory now, in the sense that he's got George taking the fight to him, and it's kind of an unknown for him. So I mean, I'm loving it. I mean, I love watching all these relationships play out. I think at the end of last year, the Sergio Max scenario kind of fizzled out, but it's still there. The talk about that deliberate crash at Monaco, I don't think anyone really addressed it properly, because it was kind of relating to an incident which happened 6 months earlier. It had kind of lost some of the sting, but I think that there's still some hangover from that between the two. And I love the needle between teammates, because if they're all getting on, then something's wrong. And I think that you need two teammates going at each other to drive that team forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we look at the other end of the grid, and you see something like Hulkenberg coming in and taking the fight to Magnussen, I think that's exactly what Haas wanted. I didn't expect it to happen, but of course it means that Magnussen's now got to up his game. He's forced to dig deeper. So I totally get why they're doing it. I just think that between Lewis and George, getting back to them, they're just so disciplined that I don't think that we're going to see the same fallout as what we saw with Nico and Lewis, where there was so much bad blood historically. And I think that Lewis is wise enough to know that he's coming towards the end of his career. He doesn't want to be seen as this guy that's going to start smashing into George. He hasn't really got that in his nature anyway. So, but it is still great to watch the dynamic of the two play out.
Yeah, I mean, to this point, not that I can say George Russell has gotten his elbows out firmly in this battle with his teammate, but of course, what we saw in Jeddah as well, when George was saying that he was confused about Fernando Alonso, whether or not he'd served his penalty in regards to not wanting to let Lewis go through on better tyres. And then, of course, the race panned out the way it did, and George just got away from his teammate as his harder tyres were much better suited later on in the race, and Lewis obviously couldn't keep up. So there was that, and then George came out and said, oh, actually, I kind of was aware of it, but he kind of was alluding that he didn't want to give anything away, into implying that he knew the situation and that Lewis should go past him to
Well,
try and keep him back.
the other incident with George is George and Valtteri. Do you remember that when
Yes,
they
yeah,
collided?
yeah.
And that was very much a George stamping his mark and saying, you know, I can beat you. I'm better than you, even though you're in a better car, and I deserve to be in that car.
Mm.
And of course, the upshot was that he didn't admit to doing anything wrong, and again, just building into that narrative of George being quite steely. I think because he's a polite guy and because he's been at Williams, everyone thinks that he's a bit of a soft touch, but he's definitely not.
I mean, do you think that's a concern for Mercedes in terms of the drivers seeing the bigger picture here? Because, in Melbourne, you already mentioned this as well, and I think this is a good thing to talk about, where Russell was complaining to the team in the early stages of the race that they've asked him to manage his pace, and now he's being attacked by his teammate when they were 1 and 2. I mean, in that position, it's easy for us to see it because we can see all the coverage, but I was watching it with my girlfriend and I was saying to her, look, the only chance Mercedes have got of keeping Max behind them is making sure that Russell doesn't go beyond that DRS for Lewis. The moment he does that, Max will pick them off one by one. He's too quick. So they need to stay within DRS of each other. But I kind of got the impression that's what Mercedes wanted, but it didn't seem to be what George Russell wanted. And I'm pretty sure Sir Lewis Hamilton would have probably felt, look, I'm just going to try and attack my teammate here. I've got the jump on Max. I can't stay behind George because Max will get me and then Max will get George. It's that kind of dynamic where what the team wants and what the drivers want are two different things right now. They're not aligning with each other.
I mean, it's always difficult. I mean, they always say and they're always reminded that it's team. It's about bringing the maximum points back for the team. But ultimately, when they're chasing wins and they're that far behind, Lewis is desperate for a win. What was it? Saudi Arabia 2021 was his last win.
That's crazy.
It's mad when you say it aloud. Having seen him win so frequently, to then go to this spell where he's not even in contention for winning, it's quite hard to even comprehend. So he's desperate to win, and he'll take every opportunity. And this is where I'm getting to with this relationship. I think if it comes down to the two of them fighting at the front for a win, I think it will not only be a test to their two personalities, but also for Toto on the pit wall to decide the outcome of this race. Will he interfere? Will he give Lewis that win that he craves to end the duck? Or will he stick with George, future of the team? That's going to be the tricky scenario when that comes up.
Absolutely. And I think we should stress, we've been talking on this for a little while now, and I'm sure one or two people listening in will make it seem like we're out in George Russell to be the bad guy in all of this. And I think we should stress that's not the case. But
no, not at all.
We've seen in the past.
It's just that he's the future, isn't he? And I think that, as I say, that I think that most people think that he's kind of the nice guy and that he's too nice. And I'm saying that he has got an edge, but you need that edge to be a leader of a team. So, there's nothing wrong with that. What he's doing is totally right. But I think that just the preconception that people have is that, George should be grateful for being in that team and should be sort of playing second fiddle, but he's definitely not going to do that. That's not his role.
No, absolutely, and nor should he. I mean, we're not F1 drivers, but from what we've seen over the years is that when you have these inter-team dynamics going on, there's always a wrestle for control, a wrestle for power and supremacy within a team. And, more often than not, sometimes, tempers can flare up and, the struggle can continue for a long time and it can be a detriment to the team. But we've seen in the past with Hamilton, for example, when he was in with Alonso in 2007 and McLaren, Alonso was very much rubbed up the wrong way because he was sold this idea that he was going to have absolute control in this team. They were going to back him unanimously. And then this young hotshot comes along, nearly wins the world championship in his rookie season, and it upsets the entire dynamic there. So Alonso moves on. The same thing happened when Hamilton went to Mercedes with Rosberg. Okay, Hamilton was much more established by then. He was the world champion. He was the marquee signing compared to Rosberg, who had just seen off a very old and nowhere near his peak Michael Schumacher. So obviously that dynamic had to change. We've seen it in other teams as well. We see it Ferrari with Leclerc and Vettel. We've seen it with Alonso going into Alpine, where Ocon was already established there, and obviously that was a bit different. I mean, we've even seen it to a degree with Verstappen and Ricciardo at Red Bull many years ago and how that changed as well. My point is, guys, is that this is normal in Formula One. Eventually, Sir Lewis Hamilton was always going to be in a position, most likely, where someone was going to come along into that team and challenge his authority or challenge his position on the throne, if you like, for the future of the team. Now it seems to be happening in George Russell. I don't see any problems in what George Russell is doing right now, other than just looking out for himself. There may come to a point where it might get a bit sour, but that can be expected in these situations.
Yeah, don't disagree. Yeah, that's where we're at.
Well, I'm glad you did. That's verified my credibility as someone that has some level of wheel knowledge from an expert. So, I mean, moving on to the situation you mentioned earlier with Toto Wolff, he's had quite a lot of interesting comments to say, mostly regarding some of Sir Lewis Hamilton's comments. But what I want to ask you, Ben, is how does Toto Wolff and Mercedes handle this developing situation? Because to some degree, it's not like it's been forced on them, but they have encouraged George being able to assert himself a bit more. It's not like they've rebuffed it and said, no, you've got to play the team game for Lewis in the same way that Valtteri did over the years. They have encouraged this.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, it's interesting that when, I'm not saying they did it because of that, but George was obviously on the radio moaning about Lewis being too quick, and then they pitted George instantly, didn't they? And I thought, that's a strange time. Was it the fact that they were trying to avoid potential conflict between the two in doing so? All relationships have to be managed, and I guess this is going to be the same. They've been there, they've done it. They've overseen the friction between Nico and Lewis. They've seen the harmony between Valtteri and Lewis as well, and two very different scenarios. I think that this one's probably edging more closer to the Nico side, but let's see. I think that they'll try and let it play out. Both drivers are always reminded about their responsibility driving for the team. And I just don't, as I said earlier on, I don't think either of them have got it in their nature to take each other out. I don't think they're that bad. Both want to win, both are keen, but I don't think that they'd go beyond the limit. I think it's quite clear that Toto has set that out, and the whole relationship within the team is such that, you must remember that you're driving for the team first and the Drivers' Championship second.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it will be interesting to see how that plays out. Obviously, there's been a history between of recent years between certain disagreements, I suppose, or misalignments in where they want to go between Hamilton and the team. Of course, it's no secret Hamilton wanted Bottas to stay on as his teammate. He didn't want. I'm not saying he didn't want Russell, but he would rather have had Valtteri as his teammate.
And that's right. Yeah.
So there's no secret in there. Hamilton has been quite outspoken this year regarding the concept of the car, the W14, obviously the ailments of the W13 last season. And this was coming from a guy only a few years ago that was saying that my team don't make mistakes. And now it's probably, it's quite the opposite from what we're hearing from Lewis.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, do you think that has contributed to Mercedes' change of, attitude towards how they want to treat this situation between George and Lewis? It does feel to me that some of the things that Lewis has said recently haven't gone unnoticed in terms of where Mercedes want to align their priorities.
Possibly. I think maybe it's also a case is that George is obviously a strong voice, and we've got Lewis is a strong voice. Perhaps they didn't have that when Valtteri was in the team. Lewis was obviously leading the direction of that team. Valtteri's feedback, it was valuable, but it wasn't on the same level as what Lewis would provide. So perhaps now that they've got these two drivers who are very vocal in trying to drive the car or drive the development in a particular area, maybe that's what they're doing now. Maybe they're forced to look a little bit more at what the drivers are saying rather than just one driver. So maybe that's what's changed. There's obviously a change of hierarchy in the development side of what's going on at Mercedes, and a few sort of people have been promoted from within. James Allison obviously moving aside a little bit to focus on the boats. So I think that there's a number of factors at play. It's all for Toto to manage, isn't it? That's what he's paid to do. It's a slightly awkward position for him because obviously he's a 1/3 owner of the team as well. So, he's got a foot in two camps, but he's obviously got to keep Ineos and that side of the business happy, and obviously Mercedes-Benz as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I was just reading this morning on social media, Toto Wolff, F1 newest billionaire. So
yes, I saw that too.
Can't feel too sorry for old Toto. It's not the worst life in the world, is it?
No, absolutely not. absolutely not. I don't feel sorry for him at all.
No. I mean, it's kind of like the old football manager's cliche of having two players vibing out for the same spot. It's not the
Yeah,
worst problem in
that's
the
it.
world to have. It's a bit of a
No.
headache. But, I mean, regarding, some of those comments, I think the one that was most telling to me was when Hamilton came out and said that the team didn't listen to me in terms of the car concept for this season. They
Yeah,
obviously,
I
yeah.
don't think he meant he. He said it, but I think he regretted it.
Well, he did. He did backtrack on that afterwards,
Yeah.
and it was a bit misunderstood. And I can understand the frustration. I think
Mm.
Mercedes acknowledged quite late on in the development of the W14 that this was not the concept to go down, and henceforth have looked to find upgrades or perhaps different concept designs more aligned with what Red Bull are doing to play catch up to them. But in the interim, of course, you've got a driver here who has won everything there is to win in the sport, still has that hunger. Perhaps he just wants that eighth world title that,
Yep.
he was robbed of a few years ago. He wants that so he can
Yep.
just go off and be done with it. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like Mercedes is the likely candidate to provide that for him. And even Toto Wolff, responding to those original comments, said, look, we want to provide that car for Lewis, but if we can't, perhaps he needs to look at his options elsewhere. I mean, for me, Ben, that is quite telling, because I could imagine a scenario a few years ago when Lewis was the top dog in F1 where Mercedes would be clamoring at everything to keep him on. I mean, the last contract that he signed a couple of years ago, post 2021, they would have done everything to keep him there. And
Yep.
now, whilst I feel that that hasn't changed too much, I do feel that Mercedes are open, or as a provision, seeing what they have in George Russell right now, that they're saying, you know what? We do have options here. If Lewis goes, it's not the worst thing in the world. And to be fair, they might be calling his bluff on it, because, I mean, if you look at other teams like potential suitors for Hamilton, Red Bull, Christian Horner has already said that's not going to happen. We don't have a seat for him over the next few years. I don't see Aston Martin bringing Hamilton in until after Alonso is gone. That won't be for a few years. They're certainly not going to get rid of his son. Lawrence Stroll's certainly not going to get rid of his son. And Ferrari, whilst that might be an option, it's Ferrari. Are they going to provide him with a championship car? Right now, they've got their own battle to keep Leclerc long term for the same reason. So you'd almost argue that the ball is very much in Mercedes' court in terms of how they deal with this.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and also that they won't be held to ransom if Lewis is demanding, silly money, which I don't believe he is. But if he were to be that way inclined, I think that they would also have a position to turn around and say, sorry, mate, you're not worth it. You may have won all these titles, all these races, but the fact remains, George is doing very well. You're now 38. I don't know how long you can go on and keep delivering. I have no doubt that they want to keep him, and they will do everything they can to keep him, but the deal has to be right for both parties. And I think that's obviously where we are at the moment. Lewis is playing the long game. He understands that he can be an ambassador for Mercedes for the rest of his life, and he's quite happy to play that role. And I think that he has such a good relationship with Toto that that's not in jeopardy. But what is in jeopardy is them sort of running this contract down, gets closer to the end of the year, and then I do believe that they'll be testing the resolve of other drivers. I mean, that's only natural, isn't it? That they start looking at, they've got Mick Schumacher as a reserve. I don't envisage him being given a seat ahead of Lewis, but you never know what's going to happen, do you? I mean, if they can't agree terms with Lewis, they may well be forced to look at other options. Whether they look at Lando, something like that, I don't know. They may test the contract that he has with McLaren. But if I was Lewis, I'd be looking to get that contract done. Get it done, get it out of the way, stop all the questions, focus on the rest of this year, but with a view to coming back stronger next year and hopefully winning the title next year.
I mean, are you surprised by Mercedes' apparent stance on this? Because I mean, I read something this
No,
morning at the time
no,
of
I'm not.
recording,
No,
and
I'm not. I'm not surprised because I think that they have such a good understanding with Lewis and an open relationship with Lewis that they're not afraid of him going anywhere else. So actually, the ball is in their court. It's up to them to come to terms with him and offer him terms. But by the same token, Toto has a responsibility to the other board members to investigate all the options open to Mercedes. So if you can get a young upcoming driver for a fraction of the cost of another driver, then you need to explore that, don't you? And then you obviously put it on the table and say, we could get this guy for X, or we could keep this guy for X. And ultimately, although he's in control of the team, he's still only 1/3 of that equation. So it depends on what the other guys say as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just referring to comments. I think I read an article this morning that Toto Wolff had actually admitted that Lewis had a different idea for the W14 compared to the team. They wanted to continue with the zero pods concept. Obviously, they want to abandon that. I don't know if they're going to get rid of that in entirety, but it does feel that Mercedes have acknowledged they were wrong in what they went with in terms of a performance. And we don't know what Sir Lewis would have suggested, but we could probably take a stab at it and say, well, it may have been better than what Mercedes wanted, even if he's not an expert on how to design an F1 car. And as you mentioned, with James Allison moving towards boat racing in particular, and you know, some stories saying he might be back to some capacity to help with that. It does feel right now that there is a contrast in terms of opinions of the team and driver. For me, I wonder what he has to do, what Lewis has to do. Is signing a new contract extension enough to at least retain the control that he currently has in the team? Or do you feel that even if he does that, it's still going to shift towards George Russell, who right now is asserting himself as the future of the team?
Yeah, I don't think that Lewis needs to sign a contract in order for them to listen to him. I think that they do listen to him. And it's always easy to say after the event, oh, I told you this was wrong. You know, if it would have carried on and it would have been good, then everyone would have said, oh, yeah, see, I knew it was right. It's always, you know, the better, you know, you can't lose, can you, in this scenario by saying such a thing? I just do believe that Mercedes were blindsided by engineering pride. I think that they came out with that zero side pod concept and thought that it looked so good that they just carried on with it. And obviously, in the tail end of last year, they outscored Ferrari and were making progress. And George won, and it looked like there was some legs in that car. But of course, they had all that, and also I think the noise coming out over the winter. The two things there was like, Mercedes at launch were kind of very proud, almost bullish that, this car looks great. And as far as we can tell, the porpoise's gone and it's very quick. And they just weren't aware of just how quick that Red Bull was. I think that's the big issue. And it's a big issue for everyone. But I think that's what caught them out. The fact that they were so far behind. Had it been a smaller gap, I have no doubt that they would have carried on and thought, okay, maybe we'll give this another couple more months before we bin it. But the other element was that at launch, Toto had mentioned a B concept as well, which I was only alerted to, the other day. I didn't see it myself, but he mentioned the B concept, and that was, that should have been alarm bells for anyone that heard that quote at the time, that maybe they were thinking, oh, maybe this car isn't the right for us and that we should have gone down a different route, but we had invested so much time and money in this direction that we can't stop yet, and that we have got this other idea going on, but we're just not sure yet. We're going to see what happens at the first couple of races, and then we'll make a decision. But of course, it happened after one qualifying session. So I guess you could say the good thing was that, he cut his losses early on, and that allowed them to make a decision going forward, which will allow them, less time to catch up. I think if they would have carried on in the wrong area, then it would have been a mess, and they could have quite easily tumbled much further back. But I don't know. I mean, you never know, do you? I mean, look at last weekend. I watched qualifying and I thought, Christ, this is looking really bad for Mercedes and McLaren at one point. And then you get to Sunday and everything's good for both those two teams. So apart from the engine blow for George, but you never know. It could turn around again in Baku, and we could be thinking, well, maybe we should stick with this car. But I don't think they will. I think they've made their mind up with it now.
Yeah, I mean, it's all relative. And whilst the allure of P2 this season might be, the prize, I suppose, for the likes of Mercedes and Ferrari that they can hope to get, ultimately, neither of them want to be in P2. They want to win, especially Mercedes. And, like McLaren, Mercedes have acknowledged that there is issues with their car and they need to change something a little bit later, mind you. So we'll obviously have to wait and see how that works out for McLaren. It's a lot for Sir Lewis Hamilton to have to handle at this point. It doesn't seem like an easy solution. I suppose the best thing he can do is, support the process of what's going on right now, just get his head down and just get on with it like he did last year. And hopefully he can wrestle back some of that control that George, to some degree, has taken from him in terms of the overall balance of power in the team. If you're George Russell, what do you think he needs to do right now? Because, despite the retirement in Australia and obviously having that deficit to his teammate, everything that he's doing right now seems to be what Mercedes need from a driver that's going to be a future of the team. Because I said before, Mercedes don't want George Russell to be like Valtteri 2.0, pardon the pun. They want him to be the next Sir Lewis Hamilton. He may not be ever as good as Sir Lewis Hamilton, but if he can prove to Mercedes that he can handle being on that mantle and being the guy that drives decisions and have the results and the talent to back it up, that's what they want from him in the future. What does he need to do to become that? Or is he already there?
I think he's pretty much there, isn't he? I think from a team perspective, I think the fact that I've kind of flagged it up and others have mentioned it as well, the relationship, I think that George needs a couple of clean races where he delivers points, but also needs to stay out of any potential row or discussion with Lewis at all. I think that that's really what he needs to do. If he can deliver some podiums and a win, that was obviously great for him. But he really needs sort of a low friction couple of races with Lewis for this to settle down, and then it just to slip back into the aren't they working great together narrative. That's what he would need to achieve. That's what Mercedes want to achieve. I obviously want to see totally the opposite. I don't want to see them at war because it's a great story and quite good fun. But, I think you asked me what George needs to do, and he's just got to keep it clean.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's going to be fun with this story, however it develops this season, is that we have an established driver like Sir Lewis Hamilton, which has an incredible rock-hard mentality that's been there and done it all before, so we know what he needs to do. That being said, I don't think he's ever gone up against a driver with the level of mentality of George Russell, and that is going to be telling, given how hungry George Russell is going to be at becoming the next top dog at Mercedes. So I'm looking forward to how that goes. Like you say, part of me kind of wants that to develop into a bit of an inter-team all-out war to some degree, just for the entertainment. But I think that's probably on the balance of the fact that in terms of the competitive side of things, unless something crazy happens, Max Verstappen's going to be a three-time world champion, and we may have to look elsewhere on the grid to find where the excitement's going to be.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, I agree.
But no, I think that was brilliant. Obviously, guys, let us know if you are watching this on YouTube. Let us know in the comment section your thoughts on what Ben and I have just discussed on the developing story between Sir Lewis Hamilton and George Russell at Mercedes. How do you think that's going to go down? What do you think is going to happen? And will Sir Lewis Hamilton stay with Mercedes beyond 2023? We'll have to wait and see. As always, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you're new, like the video, and don't forget to support us on your favourite pod platform with a 5-star review. We'll read out the best ones on future episodes. But until then, guys, also, actually, forgot to mention, make sure to check out the Inside Piranha Club. Another plug again, in case you forgot. Ben and Beck Clancy, great insight, great coverage on the races so far this season, and hoping for plenty more great content from you guys in the future. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's not on video, so we're not on YouTube, so you don't get to see my glorious sunshine and burning my face to pieces. But yeah, standard old school podcast, I'm afraid.
No, a problem. Do you know what? I think that is something that the nostalgics will certainly appreciate, because the whole point of a podcast is something you can just plug in, you go about your business, do that. You don't necessarily have to watch it. So no, you keep doing that, Ben. It's all good stuff. But if you want to see more of Ben in all different kinds of brightnesses and contrasts, then tell him to do some video content, and we might see that in the future. But guys, until next time, I hope you guys are doing well and keeping yourself entertained in the interlull. Obviously, Baku not too far away, still a few weeks away, so we'll have to wait until the F1 returns to our screens. But until then, guys, thanks for tuning in. Please stay safe as always, and we'll see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And remember, as always, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1. Take care.